Thank you very much, Sir Roger. It's very nice to see you in the chair this evening. I'd like to begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, on his excellent and comprehensive introduction to this debate. And I also, of course, am very grateful to the people who initiated the petition and all the people who have signed it, because this is a crucial problem for us all. And as other colleagues have said, it's very appropriate that we're debating this while Extinction Rebellion are demonstrating outside. And I have to say, I find it absolutely incredible that some people seem to think that the big problem is that Westminster Bridge is blocked. The big problem is that the Amazon has been on fire. And we need to get these things into proportion. The Amazon fires over the summer, which were lit by people, they weren't accidental natural fires, Sir Roger, they were lit by people, deliberately destroyed 7,000 square miles of forest. And the reason this is particularly worrying is because once a large amount of forest is destroyed, we then get feedback mechanisms and we will not be able to control what goes on. This is one of the most important feedback mechanisms that we need to avoid, because the Amazon rainforest every year absorbs a quarter of the carbon dioxide which is emitted across the whole world. Now, what that tells us is that fires in the Amazon are not a Brazilian problem, they're not a Latin American problem, they're our problem, they are everybody's problem. We need to own it and we need to tackle it in that spirit. And I am disappointed with the way the government has this tiptoeing approach, which suggests to me that they don't really understand the seriousness of the problem. And I don't know why government ministers don't understand it, because my constituents understand it. Di Murphy, who set up Bishop Auckland Climate Action, she understands it. Even 10-year-old Meredith Lambert-Sams, who invited me to her school, her primary school last week, she understands it. I went to Cutherston Primary School on Friday, and I was asked a lot of questions, and they were extremely well-informed children. But the most worrying question came from a boy who said to me, "What I don't understand is why proper action hasn't been taken already." And I have to say, I was quite stumped by that question, because it's not as if we haven't known for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. How bad does it have to get before we take proper action? There is absolutely no longer any room for complacency whatsoever. We only have 12 years now. We have got to sort this out. Of course, we're really concerned about the Amazon because of the impact on the climate, and I do think that is the priority. But I would just like to remind people of the biodiversity in the Amazon, because we're inhabiting this globe not alone, but alongside others. It's one of the Earth's last refuges for jaguars, for harpy eagles, for pink dolphins, for two-toed sloths, for pygmy marmosets, for saddleback and emperor tamarins and Goldie's monkeys. There are thousands of birds and butterflies and other insects. And when we think about looking after the planet, we have to do it not just for ourselves, but for all the marvellous flourishing of biodiversity which there is at the moment. I'm disappointed that the Honourable Member for Fylde has left, because he said that he was very concerned that we should not be implementing trade sanctions, because we should have a more collaborative approach with the Indigenous people. I think he hasn't read the petition, because what the petition says is Indigenous people have called for the EU to impose trade sanctions on Brazil to halt the deforestation because they fear genocide. So the Indigenous people have been living in a sustainable way in the Amazon for generations, and of course the Honourable Member for Winchester is right that with modern science, we can use the resources of the Amazon in new and creative ways, particularly in medicine. But I think we need to be very careful about behaving as if we're the experts and the indigenous people don't know what they're up to. Because it's clear that their way of life was not destroying the Amazon in the way that our way of life has been. And I think my honourable friend, the member for Bristol, made an excellent speech about the exploitation of the forests and the urgent need for us to cut our meat consumption. Now, when she and I were first discussing this 3 years ago, I thought she was being a bit zany, but I have been totally persuaded that she has a really strong case, and we do need to think about this, and we need to act on this as individuals and as a nation. Because what we need to do really is we need to move from talking about it to taking action. And there are some actions that I think are particularly pertinent here. Now, the petition calls for trade sanctions, and we've had quite a lot of debate about whether or not we need to collaborate or have trade sanctions. I'm not sure that I think this is necessarily a choice. I mean, if we take another but connected area of public policy, of course we put money into the universities to finance R&D, but we also have laws to protect people's intellectual property. So we can have a both-and approach. We can collaborate, but we need to have sanctions when things go wrong. And like my honourable friend, the member for Bristol, I want to refer to a debate which I initiated a few years ago in a speech that I made at that time, because we had a debate before the Paris summit. It was a backbench business committee debate in the main chamber. And everybody was saying, oh, it's all going to be absolutely marvellous because everybody's going to turn up and they're going to volunteer their contributions, and that's the way to get everybody on board and you'll all be absolutely marvellous. And I'm afraid I stood up, and people thought I was zany then, and I said, this is no good because these commitments are not legally binding. And if they're not legally binding, how can we be confident that we're going to meet the targets that we have to meet? We need to, the science is not going to change. We know how much carbon we must not burn. Therefore, we need to make commitments that will achieve the scientific objective, and they need to be legally binding. Now, what being legally binding means is that there's a penalty if countries don't abide by them. And I think that we should think about other areas of international law where we do have penalties when countries don't fulfil their obligations. And we should borrow our experience from other areas of international law and adapt isn't the right word, and use them in the area of the environment. And I'll give an example. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we took sanctions. We were appalled by this. We all thought this is absolutely dreadful. But when Canada left Kyoto, we took no action whatsoever. Now, Bolsonaro is behaving in an utterly irresponsible way, as honourable members have set out. We're proposing to take no action. This is not serious. We need to get serious about this. We need to have legally binding international agreements. So one of my asks of the minister is that when ministers go to Chile for the next round of the international negotiations, and they're looking at what the format and the structure should be, we need to have a proper, clear legal base. We need to move away from voluntarism towards legally binding treaties. The other thing is, as other colleagues have said, the danger in this Mercosur deal is that if we cut tariffs on beef, we incentivise the destruction of the rainforest by the Brazilians and the other Latin American countries. And then we become complicit in the destruction of the forest. Now, I raised this with the Minister in the Chamber at Foreign Office Questions, and he said to me, well, he didn't think that I was right about this because he thought that cutting tariffs was good for the poorest people and the poorest, most low-income farmers in Brazil. Now, I'm afraid I don't believe that, because what we see here is the indigenous people, and they are the poorest people, wanting tougher action. And what we also see is the large agribusinesses and the international multinationals making the profits when we do have this large-scale ranching. So I really think he needs to rethink that. We need to line up with the French and the Irish and the other countries and say, no, a trade deal must be done on the basis that it is consistent with Brazil's... Yeah.
A very passionate, a really great speech. And according to the sort of figures that I've seen, according to the International Labour Organization, some 62% of slave labour in Brazil is employed in livestock, farming-related businesses. So that is, as you say, it's not the indigenous people that are benefiting from this trade. It's actually people that are being grossly exploited, that are, that are at the heart of it.
Yes, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and she brings me onto my next action, because the fact of the matter is, and we see this all across the globe, you often have environmental destruction and human rights abuses in the same places going on, all jumbled up at the same time. And we're seeing this here as well. And it's one of the reasons why I also hope that the government will take a more sympathetic view than it is currently to the negotiations which are ongoing in Geneva on the UN binding treaty on transnational cooperation and human rights, because that would put obligations on the transnational corporations to respect human rights, and we could extend that to respecting environmental rights as well. So I think the priority at the moment is not to sign a trade deal that will incentivise further destruction of the rainforest. That's the number one priority, but there are a range of things the Minister could do. And as well as us discussing this here, of course, the Pope is holding an Amazon Synod in Rome. And I was very struck by what he said when he opened this on Saturday. And I think this is very appropriate, and I think it sets in context what the problem is. He's also got 400 groups from 400 indigenous communities in Rome alongside him. He said, what we have to stop is the greed of new forms of colonialism. Thank you very much, Roger.